What a great room full of enthusiasm and excitement and expertise and, oh my God, I'm miserable. The guy who runs up Kilimanjaro, jeez, gotta follow him. 7-year-old, hacker, 12-year-old hacker dude. The I girl who has figured it all out. I mean, she's brilliant. All these people are brilliant. The aerialist, okay, who has no face. What am I going to do? Stand up? No. I'm not even really disabled, okay? And I lied, okay? I lied coming here. He said that I didn't allow being a paraplegic to define me. Actually, I did. I allowed being in a wheelchair to define me. I did. I'm sorry. I'll explain a little bit about how that's actually not a bad thing, but I mean, what a mess. What a mess. I mean, this is a catastrophe. I can't possibly follow all of these various acts here. I mean, what, shark attacked surfer? Come on. This isn't fair. And I'm not going to help you find your passion. I'm just not. Okay, I'm not. That's not. I mean, I missed the memo. But I've done TED Talks for years and years and years, going back to the 90s, and I had no idea what they were when I first started going to the TED conference out in Monterey, California. We'd get together. There were these techie guys. I mean, Steve Jobs was there. There were all these, Bill Gates and all these people who would become, icons of the 21st century. And, mostly they were just sort of rich guys who would show up, and then there were rich people who weren't brilliant but had a lot of money and could hang out with brilliant people, and having a lot of money and hang out with brilliant people was really cool, all right? And then there were some novelists there, I'm a novelist, that and a subway token will get you, right, to the Bronx. But they had this kind of network together. They were curious about each other's ideas, and they would talk about each other's ideas. Of course, there was a lot of tech things changing, and TED, of course, stands for Technology, Education, and Design, and the original founder of TED, kind of a Catskills, Borscht Belt designer dude named Ricky Saul Wurman, who's actually a genius, but a kind of a goofy genius, and he just wanted something where he could have people come and explain to him all the stuff he didn't understand, like coding and hacking and stuff that 12-year-olds now understand. But he wanted them to understand them in the 90s, in the early 90s. And I went to the TED Talks, over and over again. I didn't quite understand what was happening. Sometime in the 2000s, the TED phenomenon was bought by a guy named Chris Anderson, who had a very different idea. He had this thought that TED was something that was going on in our society, in our culture, and that he was determined to make it something. I mean, he was an entrepreneur, very successful business person in publishing. I assumed that, he was just going to make TED like Coke, something like that. He was going to turn TED into Doritos. I mean, he's just like, you got to have some TED. He kind of did that, but the story is actually bigger and more profound. And I come here today to tell you about just the huge changes in history that are taking place right now. How many feel as though something's not working? Something's not adding up. Something's not sustainable. That we're living at a time of our assumptions just not adding up in some way. It could be your bank account not adding up, but how many people, just raise your hand if you feel as though, and it doesn't matter where your politics are, it doesn't matter Democrat, Republican, how many people feel as though the assumptions that we're living with right now are flawed in some way, that it doesn't quite work? Yeah, this is a story of the last election. A lot of people are feeling this same sort of feeling. I was at the Department of Justice on Monday. The Department of Justice, this is a tense organization. You got Jeff Sessions coming in there, who's got one view of the Department of Justice, and you've got all the lawyers in the Department of Justice and all the people, the career bureaucrats of the Department of Justice, who are, some from the Obama administration, some who go way back, to the Clinton administration. And they all are there to enforce the laws, to basically enforce the rule of law in America. And at the top level, the Department of Justice is like full of anxiety over the Supreme Court and immigration bans and all the kinds of things that are making headlines right now. And is there an investigation about Russia and hacks and who did what to whom in Moscow and the Trump Tower, for instance. But this conference was not about any of that. And in fact, all the people at this conference were thrilled to be there because what they wanted to do, they were a part of an element of the Department of Justice that you've never heard of. It's called LISC. You can Google it if you want. It's a grant organization. It's been around for 20 years that gives money to local communities to lower crime. And then by lowering crime, to make their communities better in some way. And it's very, very local. I mean, it's like neighborhood-based. It's like 3 streets who get federal money to lower crime, to work with their police, to work with their clergy, to just try things out that are going to reduce crime, and then they develop their community. And I was watching these people, and I was moderating the conference, and I was being kind of, Mr. Entertainment, or, whatever it is they need from the smart guy from public radio in the wheelchair, and they have me come. I don't know, with magic that comes out of me. I don't know what it is. But anyway, I was there, and I was up on stage with them, and I was talking with them, and I was listening to all these people, and it was a miracle. Here in this 2017 election fear, where are things going? Are we going off the cliff? Are we rising to the top of the mountain? Do we really know what's going on here? What are these people doing? They're celebrating stories of success, of making policy work, of working together in the local community to make things happen. Sharing them from Kentucky, from West Virginia. And these are hugely important stories. Communities decimated by opioid addiction, communities decimated by crime, decimated by economic hardship, and all having worked together, funded by federal money, to turn their neighborhoods around. 2 streets, 6 streets, half cities, whole cities. Everyone sharing these stories, and everyone empowered and thrilled, and taking away from this experience a sense of, we can do it. No concern about the federal government. None. Nobody even mentioned it. Even though this was the federal government, there was no real mention of it at all. This idea that people, through stories, could change things and make things better. I want to tell you about why this matters. As a journalist, one of my first big stories, I spent a lot of time in the Middle East for National Public Radio. I got into radio, a dead medium. By the way, it was going to be taken over by television, and the radio was going to go away, and we weren't going to have radio anymore. But I got into it at the end there in the 1980s. A volcano blew up, Mount St. Helens, and all of a sudden there was a story for me to do. I was a musician, mathematician, and all of a sudden I started freelancing this volcano blowing up. It felt to me like the world was changing. When a mountain blows up, that feels like the world is changing, right? From NPR, I went to Jerusalem, saw a lot of Jewfros. I can confirm there's a huge Jewfro movement. There's actually Palfros, also, Palestinians. It's all over the place. And I'm way ahead of you. And I learned in Jerusalem and in Palestine that the links that keep people together are not political. The links that keep people together are within villages and within communities. And for all the violence that was taking place in Israel and in Palestine, and for all of the frustration and huge heartbreak that takes place in the inability of political institutions to resolve the conflict over there, and they're not going to resolve the conflict over there, and I think that's fairly clear. And we'll see what happens sometime in this century, but everything that was talked about in the 20th century will not come to pass in the 21st. But it is the individual villages, the individual families, the individual traditions within these villages, neighborhoods, communities that pass on to their young people the ways to live, the ethos to live, the rules to live by, the glue in which they can understand each other and keep going and move on and make it into the next generation. In Somalia, a place that I went to, that was, in the early 90s, there was a terrible famine there. And I went there not knowing much about the Horn of Africa. I'd certainly heard about the horrible famine that had taken place in Ethiopia that was a gigantic national story. And television, NBC's cameras went and showed the pictures of the skeleton people, and that's what they called them in Ethiopia, and that's indeed what they would call them in Somalia. And suddenly the world sent an outpouring of money, and the famine was stalled. But what wasn't stalled was the mechanisms for rebuilding the society in Ethiopia, and that was a real difficulty. And we saw this in Somalia when we went back. Somalia is not Ethiopia, and in fact, they've been to war many times. But Somalia had the same famine, and it was a famine as a result of the Cold War. Somalia was once our ally, and it was Russia's ally, and it was our ally again. And you could see the extent to which the Cold War had ravaged this place, and the militias had destroyed the government, and the government that was there, a colonial government from the Italians, had fallen completely apart. I remember going to the U.S. Embassy in Mogadishu and seeing just a wreck of a place right on the beach. There were still security guards whose job it was to wait for the Americans to return, but no Americans were returning. It was an abandoned rogue government, it was called, and there was no glue holding the society together. And that's what you could feel as you moved around in society in Somalia. I met a young boy, a little younger than our character, who's the hacker, and he didn't dress quite as nicely. He had a T-shirt on that said, "I am the boss." He also wore a grenade launcher, and he was the head of a militia, and people called him the boss. And he had a grenade launcher, so people called him the boss, I'm telling you. And with a number of teenagers and other kids, they controlled a neighborhood in South Mogadishu, and they were the rule there. They were the bosses. They were the leaders, and there was no other rule of law in that neighborhood. And I thought to myself, what's missing here? If I showed pictures as a television journalist there in Somalia, if I showed pictures to the world of the little kid who's 11 years old with a grenade launcher saying, "I am the boss, send money," what's that going to do? What's that going to do? What have they lost here that money isn't going to supply, that traditional philanthropy isn't going to supply, that can't be rebuilt quickly with a Habitat for Humanity crowd, for instance, coming in for a weekend and making some houses? These young boys were disconnected from what their fathers knew and their fathers before them knew, and they had no idea what Somalia was all about. It's not a place that had any meaning to them. The stories that identified who they were, the links that created the traditions by which they had a community and therefore a political identity and therefore the ability to live, grow food, make food, do commerce. That was all gone. And I remember Boss, looked like he was fairly well fed, and we would drive through these neighborhoods or these villages, and in one village, stacks of bodies, stacks of thin bodies and other stacks of dried bones of dead people from the famine. And I would say to Boss, these people are starving. Why don't you help them? Why don't you get them food? He said, no, they're the skeleton people. If we give them food, then we're skeleton people. That's the way it goes. And I thought, consider what's broken down. Between communities, fracture. Within communities, within families, fracture. How precious are those stories? How precious is that ability to tell a story, to make words convince people that we have an identity together. Listen to this. Friends, Romans, countrymen, lend me your ears. I come to bury Caesar, not to praise him. The evil that men do lives after them. The good is often shared with their bones, so let it be with Caesar. The noble Brutus hath told you Caesar was ambitious. If 'twere so, 'twere a grievous fault. And grievously hath Caesar answered it. Here, under leave of Brutus and the rest, for Brutus is an honorable man. They are all honorable men. Come I to speak in Caesar's funeral. He was my friend, faithful and just to me, but Brutus says he was ambitious, and Brutus is an honorable man. He hath brought many captives home to Rome, whose ransoms did the general coffers fill. Did this in Caesar seem ambitious? When that the poor have cried, Caesar hath wept. Ambition should be made of sterner stuff, yes? Yet Brutus says he was ambitious, and Brutus is an honorable man. You all did see that on the Lupercal I thrice presented him a kingly crown that he did thrice refuse. Was this ambition? Yet Brutus says he was ambitious, and Brutus is an honorable man. Sure, he is an honorable man. I speak not to disprove what Brutus spoke, but I am here to speak what I do know. You all did love him, and not without cause. What cause withholds you then to mourn for him, O judgment? Thou art fled to brutish beasts, and men have lost their reason. Bear with me. My heart is in the coffin there with Caesar, and I must pause till it come back to me. Shakespeare, Julius Caesar. Marc Antony's speech at the funeral of Julius Caesar. At a time of text society where civilization has left the land of stories told from memory and emerged into a new world of stories from text, and Shakespeare, of course, is the great leader, the great champion of text and words. Here he is, speaking a story, an oration, which is, of course, from the Roman Empire, and looks back at that era of Greece and Rome, looks back at the era of Mythos, where words were designed to convince. Do you hear it in that speech? First of all, it's in rhyme. I mean, it's in rhythm. It's in iambic pentameter. It can be sung. The speech can actually be sung if you have a violin with you, or a keyboard, a guitar. It starts out saying, "Oh, Caesar, to hell with him." And it ends up by saying, "Caesar, my God, what have you done?" It's convincing. It's what Mythos is about. Words used to convince people, not to trick them, not to trick them with fear, not to trick them with anger, not to get them all riled up over the people next door who are supposedly terrorists. just use that as an example. Consider the rhetoric we have today and how it doesn't accomplish the things that Mythos accomplishes and what Shakespeare accomplishes in this simple, single speech. So, friends, Romans, countrymen, I got into radio because it was kind of something I could do, right? Guy in a wheelchair. I mean, mathematics, music, I don't know, surfing. These are not big opportunities for me. And indeed, because of a car accident that rolled over a 200-foot embankment when I was 19 years old, I discovered that I was never going to be able to walk again. And I mean, I could go up this little bump here. Please clap. It's the best I can do for you today. Sorry. It's kind of aerialism, a little bit, you know. I got into radio because I love journalism. I loved theater. I did a lot of theater before my accident. But suddenly in a wheelchair, I had gone from a situation where I was a white guy from the suburbs whose idea of what his life was going to be was all kind of programmed. It was all clear. I was going to go to college, going to do something like my dad did, artsy, maybe brainy, maybe lawyery, maybe doctory, maybe sciencey, who knows. It was all programmed. Boom, 19, in a wheelchair. It was indecipherable nonsense. What was I going to do? I don't know. What do you do? What's the book? How to be a paraplegic. There is no such book. And the great favor that was done me was not, I was told, don't be depressed, don't, let everything get you down, get on that horse again, damn it, just move on. It wasn't, the great gift that was given me was suddenly there were no rules. So there was no script. Now, at 19 I was kind of terrifying. I can't feel most of my body. That creates all kinds of complications for teenagers, right? I had to learn how to walk, how to move, how to turn around, how to do this, how to get people's attention, how to tell stories, how to play music again. And finally I end up in journalism, working for National Public Radio after a volcano in this media that's dying called radio. And I remember part of my early experience in TED was meeting a fellow by the name of Marvin Minsky. You can look him up. He's an extraordinary guy. He was a TED talker, a TED presenter. Became a very, very dear friend. He died this past year. He's the inventor of, basically the founder of artificial intelligence. And he talked about how computers are mastering chess and computers are mastering tic-tac-toe and Go and all these sort of games that bespeak what artificial intelligence is. And he says artificial intelligence is none of this. So what's artificial intelligence? It's vision. You can get a computer to understand what we do when we see. That's the beginning of artificial intelligence. He would say that, and he so admired what I did in radio, and I couldn't figure out why. He said, because you impart so much information in your voice. A computer can't even begin to put all of the information that comes through your voice. Not the words, the expressions. Add the body to that. Add the hands. Add the wheelchair to that. And all that information that's coming through, all that power that's coming through, a computer can't touch that. That's story. That's art. That's what art. That's the bar artificial intelligence is trying to overcome in the grand 21st century Olympics. So I said that TV killed the radio star, and that's because I always believed that TV was going to kill the radio star. When I got into television and met my wife, Allison, and we had 5 kids, that almost did kill the radio star, but it had nothing to do with television. That was just 5 kids. Oh my goodness. But what I realized, and as TED changed from what it had originally been in Monterey to what it is now, this evangelical movement of people, young people like yourselves, getting up and telling stories. In 1971, the thing people were most afraid of in America, besides crime and some of the sort of obvious things that were political and rather superficial, they were afraid of public speaking, right? Today, TED has dealt with something that most people spent their entire lives being afraid of. But what is TED doing? What is happening that matters to civilization that TED is doing? I think TED and the success of TED is dealing with that anxiety all of you expressed a moment ago. What doesn't add up? What's not quite working? We're not listening to the federal government anymore. We're not listening to the United Nations. We're not listening to the big stars. I mean, Beyonce, maybe we're listening to. Music's good. But what we are listening to are the stories. The stories within each one of us. The re-emergence of the oral tradition that binds us together. The reason why the Department of Justice is telling stories rather than playing politics in Washington, D.C. What you're doing and what we're all doing is healing the society that we live in. And it's a self-healing process, and it's a hopeful process. And because all of you are involved, we have many great things to look forward to, and they're all stories. Thank you very much.